Hey everyone, welcome to our last topic for this particular course. I'm going to cover responsive web design. There's a lot to responsive web design, so we can't really cover all of it in this course. It's more like an introduction. But responsive web design, or RWD, is the approach that we use to building this site that can comfortably be viewed on all kinds of devices. It doesn't matter if we're using a desktop or a mobile device or a tablet. We're going to use the same URL and the same code, but we're going to have different styles applied based on whatever that viewport size is. Now there are three main techniques that we can use for RWD. There's the flexible grid, the flexible images, and the CSS media queries. Now instead of a layout being static, we can use methods to have elements squeeze and flow into whatever available space they have. This is called the flexible grid. And we saw this happen when we used the CSS float property before, but there are more advanced techniques that you're going to learn in the advanced CSS course available here at the school. You'll go over the CSS flex box. That means items are going to flex and fill any additional space or shrink to fit into any smaller space. For example, notice that my flexible boxes are contained inside of this blue background. That's the flex container. Now as I move and expand my window, you can see that those boxes are flexing to match. We also have the CSS grid, and this is essentially just a grid system. It's laid out like a grid with rows and columns, and it's easier to design these web pages without having to use floats if we do it in this manner. So if I were to move my screen around, everything stays in its place inside of that grid. And the third one is Bootstrap. It's really popular, it's been around for a while, and it's pretty easy to use. You can see just by looking at this example, as a viewport condenses, the layout changes as well until you get to a point where it's mobile and it looks completely different even though it's not using a different URL or different HTML. Now another one that you can use is called flexible images, and this is where images or other media is going to scale in order to fit into its containing elements. We can set flexible images just by changing the max width to 100%. We'll do that in just a few minutes. And the third one is the CSS media query. These are just rules in CSS that are only going to be applied when our viewport changes or if there are other conditions that are being met that we specify. Let's go ahead and open up the week 14 demo file for responsive web design that's found out in Blackboard into our VS Code. I'm also going to open up the live preview, and I'm also going to open our live server. Notice how we have a really large image? Watch what happens when I resize my viewport. The image gets cut off. Well, we don't want to have that happen, so to make that image respond to be very flexible, it's pretty easy. We're just going to add a single line to our CSS. We'll use our image selector and then set a max width of 100%. What's happening now is our image is scaling down to fit whatever its respective container is. However, it will never stretch to be larger than what its original size was. If we used width of 100%, then the image would stretch to fill its container, even if that meant growing outside of whatever its original size was. With max width, once it reaches 100%, that's it. It won't continue to grow even if the viewport changes. It will, however, shrink down as the viewport changes. If we look through our HTML, we're looking at several different articles, and they're talking about the moon. Now each one of these articles has an image, a paragraph, and a heading. Let's target those articles and give them some styles to work with. We'll change the background color, the width, we'll center the element itself and the text inside. We'll add some margins and round the corners and maybe play around with some linear gradients. That looks a lot better. Let's take a look at another image. Because to fit onto a smaller screen, a mobile browser will render the page on what we call a canvas or the viewport. Then it's going to shrink that down to fit the width of whatever the screen is for that particular device. So for example, on an iPhone, the browser Safari renders the page as though the screen was 980 pixels. Then that rendering is shrunk to the screen, so 320 to 420 pixels, let's say. Well, we can define the initial viewport size with our meta element, and we tell the browser to set the width of the viewport equal to whatever the width of the device's screen is. We use the meta element with two very important attributes. The name attribute contains the value viewport, and this gives the browser all of the instructions on how to control the page's dimensions and scaling. And then the second one, the content, has two values. Where the first one is the width that we set equal to whatever the device width is, that's setting the page's width to follow the screen width of the device, and that's going to vary depending on whatever the device is. Whereas the initial scale we set to 1, and that's the initial zoom level when the browser first loads the page. Let's go out to our developer tools and take a look at this. I'll click on the toggle device. Now I'm going to go back and add the meta element in the head section with that name and content attribute, and then I'll come back. And now we're ready to start adding in some of our media queries. Now media queries are going to display different styles, and that's based on the characteristics of whatever the browser has, like its width, or if it's in portrait or landscape mode. Maybe it's resolution, or whether we're trying to print something. For example, if I were to use a media query targeting the screen, and I wanted the orientation to be landscape, then what I'm saying is anytime that we are in the landscape mode, we want the browser to look for every declaration inside of this media query and then act on that. So maybe we want to change the background color or change the main heading. Oh, gotta fix that little space right there. And now as I go into landscape mode, notice that the H1 changed color and so did the body's background. I can also use this to toggle back and forth between landscape and portrait. Let's go back and look at that media query. Notice that our media query requires us to nest our curly brackets. This is really helpful with correct indentation to avoid any kind of possible errors we might have in the future. Our code legibility is so crucial when it comes to things like this. Let's create another media query to change the background color for when the orientation is in portrait mode. We'll go with Alice Blue. So we have our Alice Blue background until we get into landscape mode. And I mentioned we can add media queries for when the user wants to print a web page. Let's take a look at what that looks like. This time, instead of targeting our screen, I'm targeting print. I'm going to make it so that I don't want to waste a whole lot of ink when I go to print. All of these images are going to take a lot of color, so I'm going to remove all of the images that are available. And then I'll change the body so that the background color is all white and the text's color is all black. Now to see this take effect, I need to try and print this screen. Let me close my developer tools and print. Notice how all of the images are gone and the only thing that's left is black and white text? That's pretty helpful. So we already saw it in what I just demonstrated that we can test the browser for a particular feature with our media query. So for example, we tested if the browser was in landscape or portrait, or if we were trying to print something, but we can also test for additional features. The most common that we use is for the size. So whether we want to have a minimum width or a maximum width of our viewport, we can set our media query to adjust. Let's say I want a media query to target our screen, but only when we hit a maximum width of 600 pixels. Now notice in the preview right away, it's showing you that we are less than our maximum width of 600 pixels. Therefore, we need to be in a cursive or lobster font. When I go beyond that 600 pixels, that's when the breakpoint is going to take effect, that media query, and it's going to switch back to whatever its original font was. Let's take a look. I'm expanding, and there I've hit about 600 pixels, so my font has changed. And when the viewport is smaller than 600 pixels, it's going to take that media query into effect. We call this a breakpoint, and by creating multiple media queries for different breakpoints, we can control how our website looks on multiple devices. Now there's a lot of different devices out there with a lot of different widths. So W3 Schools, who is awesome by the way, they have a great knowledge base that you can leverage with some of the more common breakpoints that are out there for our media queries. Let's take a look. I'll scroll down. Now there's an example of some extra small, small, medium, large, and extra large devices. So they've already done some of that work for you. Our breakpoint currently is set for most small mobile devices because we are using 600 pixels. Let's take a look at our screen again. Now you may have noticed our navigation menu doesn't work too well unless the user has a really wide viewport. As I condense my viewport down, notice that our navigation is really one on top of another and hard to read. This doesn't look good, so we want to set up a media query where we have a maximum width of 1200 pixels. We'll create a style rule for our navigation links. The key here is we only want to target the links that are inside of our navigation. So if there are other links that are outside of our main navigation, we don't want these to be affected. So I'm going to use a descendant selector where I target only the anchor elements inside of my nav. And I don't want them to appear as if they're inline elements. I'm going to want them to stack on each other, so I'll need to use the display block property. Next, I want to remove the border that's out there. It wouldn't look too good having them stacked on top of each other with border after border, so I'll set my border to none. Because I still want to have my border when I have a larger viewport. And then finally, I'm going to use that linear background again. This will help us to offset visually where one link stops and the next one starts. Let's go back and take a look at this. Now what we want to make sure that we're paying attention to is that 1200 pixels for our max width. So notice up on the top here where it talks about our dimensions. It's already letting us know that we're currently sitting at 577 pixels. As I move this screen out, I'm changing that value. Now our original breakpoint to change our font was at 600. So as soon as I break 600, you can see that that changed. And I'm going to continue to open this up and expand. Now there's our 1200 pixels. Anything below this should change our navigation. This, of course, isn't going to work so long as I have an error in my code. Let me fix that. And I'll save my changes. So keep an eye on our navigation while I reduce my screen. Now there you can see, as soon as I made it below 1200 pixels, that media query took effect. Now when using media queries, the order is very important. Styles that are applied in the style sheet last are going to override the rules that you have coming before them. So our styles need to come after any rules with the same declaration. Typically, you're going to declare styles for smaller screens first, and then you'll start introducing styles for increasingly larger screens later on down in your style sheet. And that's all I have for a quick introduction on responsive web design and media queries. But if you have any questions on this content, please don't hesitate to ask.